Okay, but mine is going to be a far shorter presentation, I hope, which basically looks at the role of armed forces in the subjugation of the people. And I've entitled it Inchi Yenu Power Yetu. And I'm going to explain a bit as to why I have decided to use that. This has been on there, and I think a lot has been spoken about this, both from Patrice's presentation as well as Gabila, in terms of this concept called Cameroon as it was, as it is over time. And as you can see, for those who may not be very familiar with it, it has gone through a lot of changes over time. You can see from 1901 to 1911, the shape as it was, and then from 1911 to 1946 or so. So there has been changes over time. But the key elements that I would like to pull out of this is the fact that at some point, Southern Cameroons, as it was called, actually was self-governing from 1954 to 1961. There was a government in place. So we're not talking about an entity that existed in a void. It actually existed and it operated until the UN Resolution 1608 of 1961 then obligated Southern Cameroons to achieve its independence by joining either Nigeria or French Cameroon. And of course, 6 decades of occupation, and you could call it a whole lot of names: occupation, annexation, assimilation, eradication, but there's always an element of all of this over the past six decades. And then that brought us to the uprising of 2016, and of course the brutal response. So in lots of ways, in a few sentences, you could encapsulate the history of Southern Cameroons in terms of this. This photo is very, very significant. It has been used, debated, and everything. This is Mr. Biya, the president of French Cameroon. And I need to say very clearly that you would have heard from our presentations, the only person who perhaps has done his very best to be as balanced and as objective as he could, I didn't say he was, as he could, is Patrice. He tried to do his presentation in a very balanced and objective manner, in that he tried to look at issues from the point of view of an academic looking at it from a distance. But even with that, there is a difficulty, and that difficulty comes from the fact, like he said, as a student in the University of Yaoundé, he had certain lenses. His lenses have changed over time, but he remains an actor in this whole drama. If you listen to Gabila's presentation, it was a clear presentation of this is where I stand and this is where I see everybody else. And I think that is my same perspective. I'm presenting from a very, very subjective perspective. And as a subjective presenter, I'll be talking to this knowing that I have already taken sides in terms of where I stand on this. This is French Cameroon President Biya meeting the UN delegation at the 50th anniversary of what is known as Cameroon. But it is significant that when they present the map of Cameroon, they do not present the map of Cameroon as many people know it today. They present it as this, meaning two separate maps with French Cameroon as it is and former British Cameroon, which is there in red, on two separate maps, which tells you very clearly that within the UN, and it doesn't matter how you try to cheat and you play politics, there are certain things that you cannot win by playing politics. And those maps are quite symbolic in terms of why, instead of depicting Cameroon as one whole nation, inseparable, and like they say, indivisible, it was depicted as two separate countries. That is very, very symbolic. Now, Inchi Yenu Power Yetu. I'm not going to talk too much to the need to address Pan-Africanist concerns. Tolofelo, when you ask your questions, this is a question that we anticipate all the time. When you talk to Pan-Africanists, Africans, Pan-Africanists, a question, and I think Gabila spoke to it already, is we are quite aware of the Pan-Africanist concerns, concerns that we share, but we can only deal with the broader Pan-Africanist issues when we have already dealt with the little issues of the house. And I felt I should talk to that. And of course, there is the issue of language. It is not about language. It is black on black colonization, and that's very significant. Patrice, in lots of ways, addressed that in his presentation, and then Gabila followed suit when he talked about what has happened over time. It's not just something that has happened in a void. It is the mentality of a group of people, and by a group of people, I'm not talking about Francophone Cameroonians per se. I'm talking about a particular elite that was selected and trained to be the black French men and women of their time. So it was very common to say, it doesn't matter where you were born and what deep village where there was no electricity, nothing. But once you get educated to reflect, to think, and to be a French person. And it was common for a lot of people who know that people would take holidays from Cameroon, just like from other parts of French Africa, and tell you that I am going home. And by going home means that I'm going to France, which is what we understand ourselves to be. And this is something that still happens to this day, especially to those French overseas territories. In fact, when I was working in Haiti, there was a funny story. Well, not funny actually, it's a very, it makes you want to cry, but it's so typical of what we are going through. The guy who was my driver actually was narrating to me the story of the Caribbean islands, and most of them, Guadeloupe, La Réunion, all of them, vis-a-vis Haiti. Haiti is the oldest black republic in the world, over 200 years or so. But it happens to be probably the poorest country in the whole world, at least the poorest in the Western Hemisphere. That is a fact. And this gentleman was telling me, as we were driving through the Central Plateau, that, it's known across the Caribbean islands that when the French overseas territories have never had their independence, because every time they stand up and say, we want our independence, and they go to the streets, their French masters would come and have a meeting with them and say, do you know Haiti? And they say, yes. How long has Haiti been independent? They say, Haiti has been independent for the past 200 years. Have you seen the desolate condition in which Haiti is in? They say, yes. So we're giving you an option. You either stay as clean and neat and nice as you are as colonies, or we give you your independence and you become like Haiti. Which option do you choose? Then they all say, oh, we would rather be the way we are. Then they say, go back to work. Typical. But then there is a very, very clear reason why Haiti is kept the way it is. There is an underlying, and they've been talking about it, there is an underlying policy and politic that says we have to continue to subjugate Haiti and make sure that it remains down there, so it becomes a reference point for every time you want to rise up, then we use it. So in lots of ways, Haiti plays a role that many of us don't see, because all we see is just the dirt and the filth and the noise and everything. But it's geopolitically very, very important, the role that it plays in the Caribbean. And that plays itself out on our territory. A lot of people, and I hear a lot of them, will still tell you about, oh, the Northwest-Southwest divide. That is a creation. But it is a creation so that you can continue to exploit the people. And this comes from a whole tradition, culture, which is very, very scientific and very clever, but also very Machiavellic, that the French put into place. So when I talk about, it's not about language, it's about black on black colonization. When the French came, I know Patrice was trying to be very, very politically correct when he did his presentation, but I've heard him in other interviews where he talks about, he actually breaks it down to tribes. And that's very important, that the French looked at the whole range of peoples and then chose a particular group of people and said, these ones, they fit the characteristic of the kind of people we want to use to carry out our history of subjugation. They have a culture of not being able to save. They have a culture of destroying everything. When you give them anything to manage, they just destroy everything. They don't think about tomorrow. It's about the here and the now. Then they pick a few boys out of them. And Mr. Biya is one of those boys. Young age, 16, 17, 20. And if you look at it, the likes of Manu Dibango, Francis Bebe fall within that generation of young people who were taken at 16 and 17, taken to France and educated. And in the process of educating them, they are studying them. Eventually, they come to the conclusion that this one, he suits the profile perfectly. So they take him back and drop him back onto the territory and say, you've got a role to play. And of course, scientific as it is, it doesn't work with all of them, because they may have all come from the same tribe. But while Mr. Biya fitted the Pacific so well, you have somebody like Mongo Betty who was a complete rebel, which tells you that you cannot bundle a whole people and say you are all stupid or you're all this. Out of that whole people and the culture, there are individuals who come out and they are what they are. But resources, Kabila nailed it, so I'm not going to talk about it. Be it apartheid in the days, be it whatever, people may say it's black on black colonization, everything is always about economics. And if we miss that, then you're missing the whole thing. Nobody benefits anything from just discriminating against you. Discrimination comes from the fact that you've got something that I want, or there is something that we both need that I want the lion's share. For that reason, then I put you somewhere, be it slavery, slave trade, it was all about economics. And like he was saying, our people have got this tendency to argue and say, oh, you know, the United Nations, why are foreign powers not coming to intervene? We need to ask ourselves, economically, what are these powers going to gain? Nobody is going to come help us simply because they are very nice. And that, I think, is something we need to look at. Then, of course, reducing a people to a system of beggarship, that goes back to the economics, and that is there. The title, I decided to use it because of the experience that I had in Uganda. 2003, I went on a mission. Tolo actually works for the organization that I worked in the time I went on that mission, and she still works there, and she spent some time in Uganda, so she would understand some of what I'm saying. But we were called to the DRC to bring in South African expertise to this area in northeastern DRC, which had been ravished by war. But the war in northern DRC, in what is called the Ituri region, was largely the occupation of northern DRC by Ugandan soldiers. On lots of pretexts, they come with lots of pretexts. Uganda went in to fish out rebels. In the course of fishing out rebels, they settled. And going in for a couple of days turned out to be 5 years of occupation of Congolese territory. And of course, it wasn't for nothing. The period they were there, and this area is where they had large chunks of coltan, which is what we use for our cell phones, and a whole lot of extractive minerals that they were getting from that territory. That's why Uganda stayed on for 5 years. And of course, Rwanda has done similarly. Southern part of the Kivu region. It's basically the same thing. It's all about resources. But what stood out of that particular trip when we went to DRC, and we stayed there for a while, was one of the workshops we were running. And a gentleman was explaining what they had gone through as the people of the Ituri region. And when you facilitating the workshop, and he's talking about what they had gone through, the abuses, the killings, the rapings, the everything. And even when we were there, we had areas which were kind of quarantined, because you wander out of that area, which then you're wandering into what is called the red zone. It means there is no guarantee that you're coming back. And it was very common to get to have a conversation with somebody, they turn the corner, 20 minutes later they come back in a body bag. That's how bad it was. But he was explaining the situation, and I think some of the people who perpetrated these crimes in Uganda then, and of course especially the DRC, they've been taken to the ICC. But the gentleman was narrating the audio, and he was so hurt when he was doing it, and listening to him and looking at him, it wasn't so much what he was saying. It was the humiliation that he was expressing when he was talking about it, what they went through as men who had completely been emasculated of their territory, of their lives, of their everything. And he said, every time we tried to raise it with the Ugandan soldiers, they used an expression. They said, inchi yenu, power yetu. And it's funny because that was my very first lesson in Swahili. Because then I had to find out what it meant. And it basically said, the territory might be yours, but we have the power. And that was the attitude they used. And that has been the attitude that Southern Cameroons has suffered for the past almost 60 years. When he talked about the 200 policemen and how Ahijo brought his soldiers in on a pretext and took over, then it became a regime of inchi yenu, power yetu. You might call it your territory, call it whatever name, the power belongs to us. And that is the role that the military has continued to play to this day. So we may talk about the politicking and the trickery of the Fumban conference and everything. The bottom line is that the military have played a central role in the subjugation of the people. So So and how do they do this? Use of extreme violence. And it's important for me, in one of the presentations that Professor Anyangwe did quite a few months ago, it's funny because while he was talking about it and the things that he saw it, many of us didn't see, and probably none of us here saw it. He saw it, he lived it. And the same kind of hurt and humiliation that I saw in the eyes of this man in northern DRC, I saw in Professor Anyangwe when he was expressing it. And it is that emasculation of you where you feel like, back to your husband, Mangang, you were talking about it, the husband in the home and everything, and somebody walks into that home and you're nothing because they hold a gun that you don't hold. And for many of us, and I talked already about the setup, the Kale, the tribal northwest, southwest, and they use all kinds, and we've already mentioned quite a bit of the tribal tensions. It's not for nothing. Very often, the regime uses it against one another so that it does not allow you to rise up as one person. And that is how we've been kept divided for a long time until 2016 when, by some miracle, people forgot about their differences and they just focused on the enemy, which is what has brought us to where we are today. Now, the psychological makeup of the Cameroonian military. When I talk about Cameroonian military, it reflects very much the general Francophone military across the African continent, whether you like it or not. And again, another experience, still in the northern Congo, 2009, 6 years later, I go there on a mission. I was part of a UN mission, like kind of exploratory mission that they had put into place, something that had never been done before, which was called the Joint Monitoring Teams. And these were teams which were made up of civilians, of policemen, and of military soldiers. And the job of these teams were to go into what they call priority axis, where hitherto were rebel held, and then they had been taken back. But because the rebel had so badly destroyed the social fabric, it was important to rebuild it. And our job was to go there and help the soldiers, the police, the administrators to start rebuilding this axis. Now, what stood out of this was that the majority of the military, the police especially, who made up the joint monitoring teams, came from French-speaking Africa. Of course, it's in the Congo, it's French-speaking, and you're asking countries that have got some kind of stability to come to step in and help the Congolese rebuild their social fabric, including the judiciary. And that was when I had first-hand experience of working with Cameroonian military and policemen and understood a lot of their mentality, their psyche and everything. And I was lucky because I came from a background of having lived through with them. So I understood them, I understood how they operated. Now the difficulty for a lot of my colleagues coming from Western countries, I happen to be, I think, the only African on the team that was not military. The rest were Europeans. And of course it was coming on, I'm a lawyer, I'm a professor, I've got this qualification, I do this. And they come in with this air of knowing, coming in to help and put things in place. And you're having to be part of a team. And it wasn't just teams in terms of teams because we meet in the morning. We were in very, very red zones, which means you're not supposed to be on your own. So we worked together, we drove together, we slept together, everything. So if you hated somebody, then you have to live with hate night and day all the time for a long period. And so then you're having to deal with, they were having serious difficulties dealing with these Francophone policemen who come from a completely different culture. The policeman is right. He knows what he's talking about. He comes from a place where when he says this, that's it. And now you're dealing with people who come from a human rights background, human rights lawyers, people with a whole lot of different experience from Western countries, largely from Scandinavian countries, where the culture is a completely different thing. This African policemen from Francophone countries. But that's when you started to understand a lot of what these guys have been trained in. And it took a long time for me to explain to my colleagues that, listen, you may be very educated and you might have a PhD or a master's or 7 masters. When you're on the field with these guys, they've been trained and they've got a master's in something that you do not have. That is sadism and psychological torture. And it was very subtle things that just made you mad. It was this brilliant woman from Sweden who came in very passionate about what she wanted to do. And then she was told, you're a woman. And because it's so dangerous out here, you cannot drive a car. So because you can't drive, and of course she's Scandinavian, She's coming from a country where there is no difference between men and women. There's a country of human rights. It means that if a man can do, I can do. Nothing should stop me from doing what I want to do. But it was a nice way of just torturing them and getting them to understand that we may be part of a team, but right here, I'm the boss. But it also went to very, like I said, subtle things, but also the culture of where people were coming from, where you will have, for instance, typical of our policemen. We go to jail. Part of our job was to go inspect the jails and find out when were people arrested, how long have they been in jail. Normally the law says 48 hours, then they should be taken to either to court or wherever. And you realize that this old man has been sitting there for the past 3 weeks or 1 month. And you ask, what is his crime? Oh, no, his son sold a piece of land to somebody, and because the police were looking for the son and they couldn't find him, they arrested the father, dumped him in jail. Yeah, but this is interesting. This is the Congolese police that has done this. The job of the other policemen from other countries is to help them to rebuild the fabric, the police. And what do you get? My team leader from one of the Francophone countries says, yeah, but it's true. If you want to get out of jail, you must go get your son. But he's in jail. So then I'm the one who's telling him, no, but it doesn't make sense. You cannot punish the father for the crime of the son. And then I tell him, but remember, now it's not a nice thing. He's your team leader. He's a policeman. He cannot use a computer. He can't write the reports, so I have to write the reports. I have to do everything, but he is the team leader. So then you need to tell him, normally you're not supposed to oppose him. You're not supposed to make him look stupid in the presence of others. Then I have to pull him on the side and say, listen, but remember, the handbook says this. He's like, oh yeah, you're right. Then he goes back and says he has to let him go. But it just comes back from, no, it's true. It comes back from the culture that we are coming from. Anybody who knows, all of us, we know that if Paddy doesn't like me or for any reason, but he's got an uncle who's a policeman, and he goes to the uncle and says, Milan did 1, 2, 3. There's no question. They grab me, they dump me in jail, and that's it. And at the end of the day, it's either going to be at the mercy of his uncle or some uncle of mine who's also a higher policeman who comes and gets me out, or my family pays something, which is what the Cameroonian military is actually doing to our people now, because what they're doing is they're arresting them, dumping them in jail, and then they ask for exorbitant amounts of money to get them. And when you've seen some of the pictures that you've seen and everything, and you've got a son in jail, and you're imagining what could happen to that son, then you'd go borrow and steal or beg, whatever you have to do to get the son out as quickly as possible. So there is a culture to that. And while my colleagues could not understand how I was able to just glide through these issues, but I could glide through them because I already knew who I was dealing with. For many of them coming from these developed countries, they became really underdeveloped in the face of these guys, because these guys are experts in everything that has got to do with sadism and torture and everything. And that is what our people are having to deal with. And of course, that's why it became a puzzle and difficulty for them. So the one thing that I wanted to underline in this, and back to the Cameroonian military, is that there is the tendency, and if you go to, even when you talk to the guys of refugee affairs, for instance, here, and you tell them, they say, no, but why, if you don't want your government, why don't you just vote them out? Now, this is a status determination officer, and I'm trying to explain that, listen, my client cannot just vote out this government. He says, no, it doesn't make sense, because here in South Africa, if we don't want the government, we just vote the government out. And I'm like, you don't understand. It's not about the government and the democratic mechanisms that are in place. It's about the military. And the one thing that very often we tend to do is to underestimate the power of the military. And by the military, I'm here talking about the armed forces as a whole. So anybody who carries an arm, be it the police, the gendarme, the soldiers, they are all the same. So there is a psychological makeup which is not just unique to Cameroon. It is actually something that spreads across most of Francophone Africa. So, he has got a story to tell in terms of what happened to him. Exactly. A few months ago, he went through it. He was arrested and dumped in jail, simply because he dared to talk. But it happens. It is happening. So, and it goes to, and it's normal, which is what Gabila was talking about. It's normal. Like some people will say, but Why do you find it so strange? This is normal. The police, the role of the police is to do what the police does. And so people might be thinking, why are they doing this? Even the police know that they are doing their jobs, regardless of the laws and everything that we have in place. So moving away from the general, I want to now zoom in or out into the particular. It's about the particular case of Southern Cameroons. It is important that we understand that we are talking about people coming from two different histories. We may have debates, and the debates are ongoing. We've got a German past. Patrice, for instance, wants to pin it down to a German landmark, and then we take it from there. But these are good questions you were asking. Why, and I think it's Pretty was also asking, why do you want to start from the German past? Why don't we go back to prior to the Germans? And of course, when you go to that, then the dynamics change completely. And that is why we are saying, let's not be too clever about this. Let's not go back to the past. If we go back to too much of the past, we might end up in a past where we were nothing but tribes. And so there was no nation state as such at the time. The nation states were built and understood as they are, following the structures, the United Nations statutes in 1960 and 1961. French Cameroon had its independence in 1960. British Cameroon had its independence in 1961. So there is no way anybody can come and argue and say this is one country that is one and indivisible. These are two separate countries which, due to a whole lot of everything from the trickery of the colonial masters to everything and the desire for brotherhood, decided that let's come together. But in the process of coming together, there was one brother who came to the negotiating table with a bit of too much clever, while the other was just coming and saying, my brother, I'm coming for an embrace. And that is where it all went wrong, because one came in thinking that, oh, it's all about brotherhood and fraternity, and the other, of course, with the support of their French colonial masters, and I think they both talked about the interest, the economic interest of the French, came in with an agenda that went beyond just brotherhood, which is what then got us there. But the one thing that I wanted to highlight also was French influence, and a lot of people wonder, why do you still see yourselves as being Anglophones and Francophones? Partly, it is the influence, the French influence over us over time. The average French-speaking Cameroonian has had to live with the French culture for about 102 years. If you take it from the First World War, when the Germans lost the territory that used to be German Cameroon, then it means the French have had a whole, and this is not just with Cameroon alone. Most of French-speaking Africa is about 102 years of French influence. We have got a French influence by proxy of about 57 years. So what happens is that the policy and the attempts at assimilation and eradication has not really taken root to the point where, in spite of the efforts of the regime, the education that we were provided and everything has not really been, hasn't gone to the roots to the point where you can say these people have been assimilated as was the desire. Take, for instance, witness of atmosphere, environment of intimidation, emasculation. I've talked about it. The Calais. I saw quite a bit of that. Way back from going through primary school. You get up in the morning, you're going to school, you pick up your bag, you step out of your house, and right there, your father, not mine, but I saw lots of fathers in the neighborhood in which I grew up. He's sitting in the mud on his, right there with some policeman who has not got his social status, has not got anything, but simply because he's some boy, by the way, who's just come out of the police school, has got nothing, but he's got a gun, takes the father and say, hey, you sit there, and everybody kick, you sit. And then at the end of the day, which goes back to that humiliation, then it starts to brew a feeling of resentment that no amount of trying to assimilate and building bilingual schools everywhere is going to take away from an older person who saw what British Southern Cameroons was and what they're trying to make it. And I think the Calais is one of them. And then the culture of the armed person being the law unto himself, that's what it is. Unlike other countries where you can get yourself a weapon, a license to own a weapon. Cameroon happens to be that country where weapons are generally owned by the military. Civilians are not supposed to own weapons. So based on that, it's easy for a military person to kick down your door and walk in, because he knows that generally, unless you're talking about very exceptional cases, he knows that when he walks into your house, the biggest weapon that you'll probably carry is going to be your kitchen knife. otherwise he's got the gun. So it's been a culture that has permeated the society, and that's why I talk about the corruption and violence as a toolkit. Has been a society where people get what they want, either by being corrupt, and when corruption doesn't work, generally that's the government, when corruption doesn't work, then it uses violence. And that's what has happened with this uprising over the past 2 years. You try to corrupt the masses, if it doesn't work, then you use violence. And that's where we are. I think he made mention of the takeover, the policemen who were there, a country that got its independence without police. And this is not the first case. It has happened. When the takeover happened in Haiti a few years back, it was a country, an island, with nothing but policemen. And that's why it was so easy to take out the president and install another one, because there is no military. But in several countries across the world, they don't see the need for the military because there is the rule of law. Once you start to depend on the military for everything, especially when you're not at war, there is no external aggression, and you have a military, then generally the military is used to subject and subjugate the population, which is the case here. Targeted killings. Recently, the U.S. ambassador actually made mention of the fact that the Cameroonian government is using targeted killings as one of the weapons it's using to destroy, or at least fight back, the uprisings and those it perceives to be enemies of the country. But I talk about over time it breaks the soul more than the body, because a lot of the people who have championed this, and I have to say for a lot of our generation, we have lived in ignorance for a long time. Ignorance in the fact that we were brought up to believe in this system, and I think you raised it. We believe in this system, a system of being part of this nation, and even our education, we were educated to be proud Cameroonians, until you start to realize that, hey, somebody wins the election, he's supposed to take over as the president of the country, and then they sit down and say, no, he cannot take over. Why? Because he's not Cameroonian in the true sense. Somebody from this part of the country cannot be president, because by law, and they are right, by the way, if you look at it in 1984, when Mr. Biya decided to abrogate that agreement that held the two territories loose as it was, and say we are no longer a united republic, we are now back to being La République du Cameroun. By inference, it was basically saying English-speaking Cameroon does no longer exist. And as a result, you're not citizens. You're actually either colonized or annexed, but you're subjects of the republic. So as such, under normal circumstances, one, you had no business in the first place contesting election, let alone winning the elections. And now that you've won, we can just change the rule of the game and say you're not supposed to win. And that's how it happened.
And the very first elections, for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
The very first presidential election.
Exactly.
That was being organized.
Yeah. So what you're having now, and that's why I named a few of the gentlemen, because these have been the champions of this revolution way back, and I think somebody talked about it. It didn't start at a particular point. It didn't start in November 2016. This has been a fight that a lot of these gentlemen have been carrying out for the past, actually I want to go as far back as the 60s, from 1961. Already by the middle 60s, the likes of Bernard Fonlon was already pointing to the fact that something is not right here. Let's fix it. He ended up dying mysteriously. Then of course...
Actually, you pick it up when you read the history of Kwame Nkrumah, because this is where a lot of issues are coming.
Yes.
As you bring the pieces of a puzzle start to piece up. So to interject.
Yes. No, and you're right. No, you are right. You're very right. And I think even when you were talking about the struggle of the ANC and the Mandela going to jail, if you go back to his long walk to freedom, he talked about the fathers of the revolution of the actually. What the ANC did, or the Youth League at the time, actually went back to read and study the struggles of the Cameroonian patriots at the time who were trying to get independence, because that was one of the biggest first real... Yes. Yes. Some of the biggest first fighters for independence in Africa. But it has taken a long time, and what this has done to some of these gentlemen is that even while they're alive, they are walking dead. Many of them. Yesterday I was having coffee with Patrice, and we were talking about Ambassador Fosun, and when he told his story, we were in Washington, he told his story, everybody in the room just broke down and cried. And it's the same for all of them. from Goji Dinka, somebody. And what is painful about these individuals is that these are all individuals who had a beautiful life. They didn't, Goji Dinka, she knows him. She grew up next to him, so she would know the story. These are gentlemen who had everything in life, and if they had wanted, they would have sat and just enjoyed their lives without having to go through any pains. But they sacrificed their own comfort for the sake of their citizens. And all of them, most of them, if not all of them, ended up in jail. And every time they came out of jail, it wasn't the physical self that was broken so much as the inner self. They come out of jail and they're no longer the same people, all of them. And then, of course, there are always questions as to why has it taken 60 years? A lot of people have always asked the question, why has it taken 60 years? Why did you wait for 60 years to stand up and start fighting for your rights? And I say it goes back to the military. It is the use of the military from the day they drove across the borders and brought their military and took over, disarmed the police and took over. It has never been the same. If you talk too much, Bobengomdra, you talk too much, you get poisoned, you get dismissed, you get beaten up. So it just happens. And once you've seen it happen to your friend, then you've got one of two choices. You either be quiet or it happens to you. That's how it has happened for the past year. So at every single point, the military has had a very important role to play. So it hasn't taken 60 years because the people were not aware. It hasn't taken 60 years because the people don't want to change something. It has just taken 60 years to build 8 million soldiers. And that is why today, it's happening today, something that should have happened long ago. One, many of us lived in ignorance. I am one of those victims, at least one of those people who were raised in that kind of ignorant mindset that said, oh, we are all one and we're building one country. Until you start to see certain differences between you and it doesn't, and a lot of people will argue and say, oh, we're all the same. If you go to the north of the country and the east of the country, they are suffering just the same as we are suffering. But it's not about that. It's just about very little things like, you know what? I want to go to university. He spoke about it. Then I have to go study in French, even though all of my preliminary education has been done in English. Then I sit in, and you would know for those who had to study in Afrikaans. You walk into a classroom, your classmate is already got 10 years of advantage over you simply because they've been taught and reasoned in a language. You are going at that age at 19, 20, to start learning in a language where you start first of all by learning the language. While you're busy learning the language, he is busy making a degree and getting a job.
We brought 1976.
That's it. Typical. So, and 1976, he spoke about the 90s, 92, 93. At the years during which my generation was actually going into university. So it's a lot. So it has taken 60 years and it's not because we haven't tried. There's been that attempt over and over and over again, but the military has had a very significant role to play to ensure that nothing changes. So where are we today? This is the most worrying part of it, and that's why it requires the intervention, the participation of everyone. We have moved from a simple uprising, which if the political powers that be had ever wanted to address this in good faith, could have been addressed by December 2016. Today, we are facing low intensity conflict, which has the potential to be a full-blown war. And I think in one of the major newspapers of the world, a couple of days ago, yes, the Washington Post and the Guardian, they actually talked about the possibility of the next full-blown war. That's where we are as a people. And this is important when you look at this, not only in terms of that territory of 47,000 square kilometers, but you're looking at the geopolitical interests of the whole Gulf of Guinea. That's got potential. To understand the nature of today's conflict, it is important to understand how the issue of the maquisards was handled. Now, this is also very important. The maquisards, for those of you who don't know, Patrice has spoken about it quite elaborately today, and he talked about the genocide. Now, and you've heard you heard them talk a bit about the Bamileke and the Bassa, which are the two major groups which stood up and decided to fight for the independence of Cameroon in the 40s, the 50s. But from the mid-50s, a genocide took place, and it's only now that a lot of the records are coming out, and estimates stand at between 450 to 500,000 people who were massacred. Now, when I talk about the nature and the way in which it is handled, it is important for all of us to understand, especially for those of us Ambazonian, Southern Cameroonians, that the same modus operandi that was being used by the regime then is the one that is being used today. And that's why he talks about a continuum from 1940 to today remains the same. They operate the same. And so when we think about this, we need to continue to think about the fact that they are using the same tactics, the same approach, and we could end up suffering the same fate if we do not act in a certain manner. And so, of course, the questions we should be asking ourselves is, what should we do differently from what the Maquisards did in the 50s and 60s until the 70s when the last of their leaders was hanged? What are they doing? They're raising the villages. It's two things. It's the tactical approach and it is the strategic approach. Tactically, what is happening is the raising of villages. And a lot of people just say, oh, you know, these people are wicked. How could they do this? It's not wickedness. It's a tactical, it's very, very well calculated approach to this whole thing. And what a lot of our people have not done is sit down and do a mapping of those villages. And once again, he spoke about it, and you start to pinpoint the different villages, how many? 74, which have been targeted. It's not by accident. It is not just out of somebody wakes up in the morning and decides that I'm going to burn this village. Every village has got geopolitical significance. And by so doing, you don't have to. Generally, guerrilla warfare requires that everybody is a suspect, because the person who is a farmer during the day becomes a soldier at night. What you do is that you clean the villages, push them all out of the villages into confines. And what do we have? Forests. So they'll go to forest. By so doing, you don't have to deal with villages and people spread all over. You're just dealing with people in the forest. And it becomes easy to target, because they all move from their villages and they move to these pockets of forest land where they go and hide, both women, children, and men. It's very important to understand this. So tactically, that's where it's going. But strategically, there is a big strategic goal to that. Once you've moved them there, then a lot of things happen. One, you can send your soldiers into those forests. Networks, I mean, even in the most developed of countries, you might have networks in the cities and the city centers, but once you go into very, very remote areas, forest land, there is no network, which means the live streaming of what is happening, and I think somebody was talking about documenting and telling, the live streaming of whatever is happening when it happens in the cities and you're taking it live and it's going to the world, means it's happening in the forest, and you could capture all you want with your cameras. Once they get you with a bullet, then they just pick up your cameras and put them in their pockets, and that's it. So then nobody really knows what's going on. So it's out of the public gaze. Then, of course, sometimes even without coming to attack you, they've got other weapons. Two weeks ago, we heard about monkeypox. There's now the fear of monkeypox. That's what happens. The rains are coming. It's the rainy season. Then you're having to deal with mosquitoes and malaria and everything. So on the one hand, they really don't even need to come to the forest to get you. Something else in the forest will get you, because you're not used to living in the forest. But if nothing gets you in the forest, then they come in and they wipe. And that's where food blockade, this happened, of course, with the Revolutionary War of the 50s and 60s. But this also happened with the Biafra of Nigeria. It was food that the Nigerian government used a lot to ensure that it just did lots of blockades and food was not going to the people. And for those of you who saw children suffering from kwashiorkor and having emaciated bodies, was out of what they were doing. So sending our people to the forest is not simply sending them there out of the pleasure or just, it's a very, very strategic move. My worry remains the fact that is the leadership thinking about these things and planning for it, and do we have a plan B or a plan C as to how we're going to tackle this when we get to that point? So once again, the military plays a very, very important role, and while we are all looking at nothing but the political and looking and fighting the political actors, what we are not looking at sometimes is the role that the military plays. That might look very stupid because all they do is carry guns and shoot, but beyond that, there is a thinking that generally people who are not trained for it do not think about. So moving forward, I think it is important, like we have all said, that we observe closely and start to record the situation. It has to start now. We need to find ways of bypassing the bureaucracy. Colette is not here today. She's the director for URISA, the Human Rights Institute of South Africa. When this thing broke out, she is one of those who actually took a flight and traveled. They landed in Douala and they were sent back. she was sent back home. She wasn't allowed. And what were they going to do? They were going there to try and see for themselves so that they can come and tell the world. Of course, they don't allow them. They just send them back, like it keeps happening. We need to continue to apply pressure on the international community to take action. Now, what has happened we're learning after books are being written today to say, 500,000 people were massacred, they were killed by the French, they used chemical weapons on them, or atomic, whatever, on them. Now they're talking about this, and most of these people are dead and gone. It's just become a story. It's a book, and nobody's pursuing it. We cannot wait for that to happen again. It is important, therefore, that as they use the military and do all the things they're doing, we start to record now and get them to understand that they will have to answer for this now. That, I think, is something we need to prioritize. And of course, we need to prepare for large-scale humanitarian casualties. That is very important. Whether we like it or not, today, we are being told there are 160,000 refugees in Nigeria. That is the official figure. Remember that you're talking about those who have been captured. Well, when I say captured, they've been captured in the system by UNHCR and recognized as asylum seekers and refugees. You're not talking about those who are staying with host families. You're not talking about those who have decided to just stay in the forest and so on. So if you take it, and based on Patrick's estimate, I think it's him, of approximately 5,000 people per village. If you go on the basis of 5,000 people per village times 74 villages, you're talking something between 350, 400,000 people sitting out there somewhere. No food, no shelter, no hope. They have never lived in forests, and that's what's happening. So that's a very, very conservative figure that we are dealing with at the moment. So based on that, I'm going to end very quickly. Maybe I took a bit more time, but I just thought I should talk to the role of the military and what we need to start thinking of doing. Very quickly, these photos are some of the things. When I talk about the role of the military, very often when we left our houses and went to school in the morning, you would find a scenario like this, something like this. All of a sudden, military guys around and they're just getting everybody to sit on the floor, and they just do whatever they want with you. And of course, this is what was happening with the students and everybody else. Pictures that I'm sure we all seen. We are estimating that at least 15,000 people have been killed so far just from the shootings of the military. There is no school. We've got student rapes happening, abductions. I think you've been told already about our leaders who were abducted in Nigeria in January this year. We're already having reports of mass graves, and as well as, of course, the militarization of the whole territory of southern Cameroons. Just some more of what is happening in terms of the mass killings. And this one, finally, this is a timeline which we have developed, and I always present this and then say, if anybody wants this, we can send it to you. I think this has been updated until last month, which gives you a brilliant timeline of everything that we've discussed. Patrice started his timeline from 1940. We take it all the way to 1916, and others will take it as far back as 1884 with the Berlin Conference. But we've got a timeline that just gives you snapshots of what are the significant moments of our history until today. So thank you very much.